It's been years since it happened, but I still feel uneasy thinking about it. He was my first boyfriend. We met during my first year in college. He was charming back then, and we clicked almost instantly. Things were great at first. We dated for almost 2 years before deciding to live together. That's when everything started to change. I was still in college, busy with classes and my creative writing group. He worked from home. At first, I thought it would be nice to have him around all the time, but it didn't take long for him to start getting possessive. He wanted me to spend all my time with him. If I wasn't studying or at a group session, he expected me to be home. He hated my friends. Whenever they came over, he was rude to them. Eventually, they stopped visiting altogether. I felt isolated. I missed my old life, but every time I brought it up, we'd fight. The fights got worse. He'd yell at me for the smallest things. Once, he locked me in the bedroom after an argument. I had to call the police to get out. That was when I started to seriously think about leaving. But I couldn't afford to move out immediately. I was in the middle of the term, juggling assignments and exams. I tried avoiding him as much as possible, which only made him angrier. He became convinced I was cheating on him. His biggest suspicion was about one of my friends from the creative writing group. I went to those sessions twice a week, and I guess he thought I was meeting this guy behind his back. I wasn't, but no amount of explaining could convince him otherwise. He started checking my phone when I wasn't looking and questioning every text I sent. I stopped talking to most people outside of class because I was afraid of setting him off. One night, after a session, I walked to the parking lot with my friend. We were chatting, and I offered him a ride home. Out of nowhere, my boyfriend showed up. He must have been waiting for me. He went straight for my friend and started beating him. I screamed for help. A few people nearby came running and managed to pull him off. My friend had bruises all over his face. The police arrived and took my boyfriend in for the night. I remember sitting in the station, giving my statement, feeling both angry and terrified. I couldn't believe it had come to this. Because he had a clean record, they let him go the next day. He tried to apologize, but I was done. I packed my things and moved in with my sister until the term ended. Living with her was like a breath of fresh air. She didn't ask too many questions, but I could tell she knew I had been through something awful. I focused on my studies and kept to myself as much as possible. He texted and called non-stop for weeks, but I ignored him. Sometimes he'd leave voicemails, switching between apologizing and blaming me for everything. It was exhausting, but I refused to give in. I blocked his number and stopped checking my messages altogether. Eventually, he stopped. I haven't heard from him since and hope to never have to. I grew up in a small town in Texas where everyone knew everyone. It was one of those places where gossip spread faster than a wildfire. My family lived next door to another family we'd known for years. Their only daughter and I started dating during our senior year of high school. It wasn't anything serious. We were just kids who had just graduated, messing around and figuring things out. I was already planning to leave for college in another state, so I knew the relationship wouldn't last long. When I told her I wanted to end things, she completely lost it. She started crying and making a big scene, saying I didn't care about her. I tried to explain that it wasn't about her, but about my future. She wasn't having it. Then she dropped the bomb. She told me she was pregnant and that I was the father. At first, I didn't believe her. It seemed too convenient, like a last-ditch effort to keep me around. But then she sent me a picture of a positive pregnancy test. I'll admit, I panicked a little. What if she was telling the truth? I decided to meet with her and talk this over. When we met, she told me she wanted to keep the baby and that she expected us to get married and start a family together. I told her, as politely as I could, that I wasn't ready for that kind of life. I had plans, and I couldn't just throw them away. That's when she snapped. She started screaming and hitting me. It took everything in me to stay calm and walk away. I didn't tell my parents about any of this. They're conservative, and I knew they'd believe her without question. I couldn't risk that. So I went to my older brother for help. I showed him the picture of the pregnancy test she had sent me. He looked at it for a second, then grabbed his phone and Googled it. Turns out it was a stock photo. She hadn't even tried to make it look real. Relieved but also furious, I sent her the original image I'd found online. She didn't reply. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. I thought it was over. 2 nights later, around midnight, I woke up to loud banging on our front door. My brother and I were the only ones home. Our parents were out of town. The banging was so hard it felt like the door might come off its hinges. I looked out the window and saw her dad standing there, holding a rifle. Her 2 brothers were with him, pounding on the door and yelling. Her dad was screaming for me to come outside and talk like a man. He was shouting about how I'd gotten his daughter pregnant and was trying to force her to have an abortion. My brother called the cops while I stood there frozen. I couldn't believe what was happening. When the police arrived, they arrested her dad and brothers. Her dad was still yelling, claiming I'd ruined his daughter's life. After things calmed down, the truth came out. She had lied to her dad too. She told him I'd gotten her pregnant and was pressuring her to get an abortion. That's why he'd shown up with a rifle, ready to defend his daughter's honor. Her dad apologized profusely when he found out the truth. He begged me not to press charges. I didn't. I couldn't bring myself to ruin a man's life over his daughter's lies. A mutual friend later told me she'd done all of it just to scare me. She wanted to see me sweat, and she didn't care who got hurt in the process. Not me, not her dad, not her brothers. Looking back, it still makes my skin crawl. She wasn't just dramatic, she was dangerous. I'm just glad I got out when I did. I met her a few months ago. At first, everything seemed normal. We hung out, talked and had fun, but soon, things started to change. She became more intense, like she was trying to rush everything. After a few weeks, she started talking about us moving in together. It was too soon for me. I barely knew her, and I didn't want to jump into something serious. I told her I needed time. The more I pushed back, the more she seemed to push forward. It got to the point where I couldn't breathe. She'd text me non-stop, showed up uninvited and wanted to be with me every second. I tried to explain that I just wanted to take things slow, but it only made her cling harder. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, so I ended things. I told her it wasn't working. She didn't take it well. For the next few weeks, she wouldn't leave me alone. She'd show up at my work, send me messages, and call. It was exhausting. But then, one night, I ran into her at a bar. I'd had a few drinks, and honestly, I wasn't thinking clearly. She seemed so sweet and apologetic, like she had changed. She convinced me to go back to her place for a fun night, so I did. The next morning, I woke up feeling off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. She made me coffee, and we talked for a while before I decided I should leave. I didn't think anything of it until I stepped outside. As soon as I did, it hit me. She had put something in the coffee. It was a laxative. My stomach dropped, and I felt the panic rise. I had to get home, but I couldn't even make it to the bus stop without feeling like I was going to explode. I called one of my friends, hoping they could help. I couldn't stop laughing, but at the same time, it was terrifying. She could have done worse. I've never been so embarrassed in my life, walking down the street, praying I didn't make a mess. I still think about it sometimes. What if she had done something more, something worse? In the end, I didn't see her again. She still tried reaching out, but I blocked her number. It's a relief to be rid of that chapter, but looking back, it's both funny and scary how out of control things had gotten. I met my ex-girlfriend when I was still in college. I was young, broke, and living on a tight budget. She was older, working a steady job, and we hit it off. At first, everything was fine. We decided to split the rent on an apartment together, figuring it would be cheaper than living alone. But over time, I started to notice things. Little lies, small manipulations that I overlooked at first. She had a way of making everything seem like it was my fault, even when it clearly wasn't. Then, I found out she was cheating. It was a punch to the gut, but I confronted her about it. She denied everything at first, then tried to make it seem like I was overreacting. I'd had enough. I told her it was over, that we were done. But here's the thing. She didn't take it seriously. I still had to live there. I couldn't afford to move out on my own, and we had signed a lease until the end of the year. So I decided to stay, but we agreed to live in separate rooms. I thought that was the best way to handle it. It didn't take long for her to show her true colors. She pretended nothing happened between us, but I wasn't buying it. I turned down every advance she made, and that's when things started to spiral. She didn't like that I wasn't giving in. She wanted to hurt me. She started playing music loud, way past midnight. It wasn't just any music. It was the kind of stuff that made you feel uneasy, like she was doing it on purpose. Then, she started inviting over her friends. These weren't the kind of people I wanted around. Her friends were questionable at best. They'd come over, and things would get loud, obnoxious. There were nights when I'd just stay in my room, trying to block it all out. But I couldn't escape the noise. I couldn't escape her. She'd make sure I knew she was enjoying herself, as if she was trying to make me feel something, anything. I stopped coming home most nights. I'd stay at a friend's place just to avoid her and the mess she was making of everything. But no matter where I went, I knew I had to go back. The apartment was still home, even though it didn't feel like it anymore. She didn't care about the arrangement we had. She didn't care about my feelings or how much she was hurting me. She just wanted control. She wanted to break me down. It wasn't just the loud music or the friends. It was the way she'd sneak into my room late at night, stand by the door, and watch me sleep. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like I wasn't alone. But every time I'd check, she'd be gone. The worst part, it wasn't even the cheating. It wasn't the lies or the manipulation. It was how she made me feel like I couldn't trust anyone. How she took the space that was supposed to be mine and twisted it into something toxic. By the time the lease was up, I was a shell of who I was when I first moved in. I didn't even feel like myself anymore. But I left. I had to. I couldn't take it any longer. I never looked back. I met this guy when I used to live alone in a small apartment downtown. It was my first place after moving out of my parents' house, and I was still adjusting to being on my own. I'd go to this coffee shop a block away almost every weekend. It was one of those cozy places where the baristas knew your name if you showed up often enough. He worked there, always at the counter, cracking jokes with customers. He had this way of making everyone feel like they were the most interesting person in the room. After a few months of small talk, he asked me out. I wasn't seeing anyone at the time, and he seemed genuine, so I said yes. At first, things were great. He was fun to be around, always coming up with plans to keep us busy. We'd explore new parts of the city, stay up late talking about everything, and laugh a lot. He made me feel like I'd finally found someone who understood me. But after a few months, cracks started to show. He'd disappear for days without explaining why. When I asked, he'd get defensive and change the subject. He started borrowing money and promising to pay it back, but he never did. One day, I found out he'd been lying about where he lived. He told me he had an apartment across town, but when I dropped by unannounced, a woman answered the door. She said she was his fiancée. I was speechless. I broke things off immediately, but that wasn't the end of it. A week later, he showed up at my job, apologizing and crying. He said he'd explain everything if I gave him a chance. I told him to leave, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. My manager had to threaten to call security before he left. After that, he started showing up at random times. I'd find him waiting outside my apartment or see him walking by my building when I knew he didn't live nearby. It started feeling less like a coincidence and more like he was keeping tabs on me. Then things escalated. One evening, I got home to find a note slipped under my door. It wasn't signed, but I knew it was from him. It said, "You shouldn't go out alone. It's not safe." The last straw came when I found my door unlocked one night. I always double-checked it before leaving, so I knew I hadn't forgotten. Nothing was missing, but there was a single red rose on my kitchen counter. That's when I called the police. They took a report, but said there wasn't enough to go on. I packed up and moved out the following week. Even now, years later, I can't help but feel uneasy whenever I remember him. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below. It really helps and motivates me to keep creating more videos for you. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.